Church World Service listens to what people have to say in terms of their needs and the problems and the issues that concern them. And then we develop a plan together. And then that plan is put in action together.
I'll be the eyes so that I just can be.
This is another episode of a special series called Enough for All of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. This series sheds light on 75 years of an NGO called CWS. My name is Marie Bloem and I welcome you to another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast about Church World Service. And like always, I'm delighted to, with my guest of today, who will, as usual, introduce himself. Rodney, please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Rodney Page. I was the director of Church World Service, but I also had two titles. The first, last, and only person to have two titles. I was the Deputy General Secretary of the National Council of Churches and the Executive Director of Church World Service from 1995 till 2000, June of 2000.
Great. Thanks, Rodney. And actually, you were leading Church World Service through quite an important time. For Church World Service, because we were still part of the National Council of Churches.
Right.
So can you maybe share with listeners a little bit about that particular period?
Well, I can. I was hired to try to integrate Church World Service more within the National Council of Churches. Mm-hmm. There had been a contentious relationship between the National Council of Churches and Church World Service, with Church World Service wanting a more independent kind of role in existence, and the National Council wanting them to be more seen as a part of the ministry of the National Council. And I was hired to bring that Church World Service and National Council together, and that is why I was given two titles. Mm-hmm. But I saw the need, when I became the director of Church World Service, for Church World Service to play a more independent, expansive role than what the National Council envisioned. And so I, with my deputy, Linda Hartke, began a process of taking Church World Service at a more independent path than what was envisioned by the National Council of Churches. And I remember when Joan Brown Campbell, who was the general secretary, left, that she's the one that hired me. And the new director, General Secretary Bob Egger of the National Council, called me on the phone once. He was on the 8th floor and I was on the 6th. And he said, "I hear you're trying to take Church World Service out of the National Council of Churches. Is that true?" And I said, "Yes, it is true." And he said, "I want you to cease and desist right now." And I said, "Okay, I will cease and desist." Because I had done everything that was needed to do, and I didn't need to do anything more than to take. And I will never forget the telegram I received from the board of directors of Church World Service after I retired, saying Church World Service was now officially a separate part from the National Council of Churches, and my efforts were successful.
And Rodney, if you look back at it, do you think that the split was the right thing to do?
Yes, I do think it's the right thing to do, and especially in light of what is unfortunately happened to the National Council of Churches and the path now that Church World Service is going on. I think the future of Church World Service is very bright, and especially now with the new administration in Washington, D.C., and the possibility of the whole network of refugee resettlement being revitalized and reborn, and the new leadership of Rick Santos. I'll never forget in Cambodia, I was there for a meeting, and Rick Santos called me and said, I'd like to meet with you privately in your hotel room. And I said, okay. And he came up and he said, I want to know if there is a permanent place for me in Church World Service or not. I have to make some decisions about my future. And I said, I can't guarantee any job and what that will be for you, Rick, but I can say there is a place for you at Church World Service, and I ask you to stick with me, and we will find out what that role is. And it was not too long thereafter, I made him country director in Indonesia, an area director of Southeast Asia, and now he is the new director of Church World Service. Again, my biggest legacy is people I've hired and put in places of leadership.
Great. And for the listeners, Rick Santos is since the beginning of 2021 the new CEO and president of Church World Service. He had worked for Church World Service before, and so that's kind of the context there. Rodney, going back, a long time maybe, do you still remember the first time that you heard about Church World Service?
Well, that was a long time ago, back probably in 1962, when I became right out of seminary to be the associate minister, half-time at First Christian Church in Portland, Oregon. I'd never been to the Northwest in my life, and half-time as the campus minister at which is now Portland State University. And it was that time that I first became aware of the work of Church World Service, because the Christian Church Disciples of Christ were very much a part of Church World Service and the National Council. And I became involved in crop walks and organizing crop walks that the churches in Portland participated in.
What do you like about the work of Church World Service?
Well, the thing that strikes me about what I like about Church World Service from the very beginning is partnerships. Church World Service doesn't operate like some kinds of aid organizations. They see what they think is needed. They come in and do a project and leave, and oftentimes that project fails. Church World Service listens to what people have to say in terms of their needs and the problems and the issues that concern them. And then we develop a plan together. And then that plan is put in action together. And together we work to implement the needs of people, not telling people what they need. And that project then endures. I remember my first trip in Church World Service was in Vietnam, north of Hanoi, to dedicate a clean water well, because so many people, especially young and older people, were dying of waterborne pathogens, cholera, diarrhea, dysentery. And Church World Service saw as one of its main goals putting in clean water wells throughout Africa, Southeast Asia, and other places. And I was there to dedicate this well. Among them, Hmong people, I think it is pronounced. And they were people that assisted the United States during the war in Vietnam. And afterward, they were treated as kind of second-class citizens because of their involvement in the war. And so I went up to this very humble village to dedicate this well. The whole village turned out. They had dances and feasting and all kinds of. It was, and by humble, I mean very humble, because I went into the schoolroom, which consisted of 2 rooms with wooden slats that you could see the outside in.
Mm-hmm.
But there, in one part of the schoolyard, was this well. And on the side of it, it had CWS. And all through, as I say, Southeast Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world, there are these wells and people living because of these wells. So partnership is a word that I think connotates the kind of organization that Church World Service is about.
Church World Service produced a book when it was celebrating its 50 years anniversary. And as you might remember, it was called 50 Years of Help and Hope.
Yes,
And
I remember. I helped put it together.
I'm sure you did. Yeah. We are not making a book now for the 75th, but let us assume that we would decide to make a book. What would be some of the keywords that you would use in the title for 75 years of CWS?
Well, 75 years of help and hope would also be a title, but I would say the kind of words that I would use would be, besides partnership, would be listening. We listen to the needs of people, and we respond especially to the needs of the poor and the powerless, the sick, the addicted, all whose way is hard in this life. We listen. That is important, I think, in the history of Church World Service. Mm-hmm. And then community is another word that I think is apropos to Church World Service, because community and the values of faith that sustain a community are so important to us. The scriptures say, without a vision, the people perish. And what is that vision? It is simply the writings of the Old Testament prophets, the writings of the New Testament, and the sayings of Jesus, and what they had to say about our common commitments, the values that we hold in common with one another, the sense of community that we have. And the phrase in Micah, and what does the Lord require of us? But to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with our God. And also in the Paul's letter to the church in Galatians, in the 5th chapter, where it talks about what our values are. The fruits of the Spirit, he say, are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. He goes on to say, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a person sows, that shall they also reap. So let's not grow weary in well-doing, but let's do good to all people, and especially to those of the household of faith. And I think when we move towards that vision, that when we move towards it, slavery is ended, and civil rights achieved, and compassion is implemented, and human rights are defended. But when we move away from those kind of values, greed triumphs, narcissism envelops us. Greed and selfishness erodes our common life, and our conflicts proliferate.
Hmm.
So the values that church world service and the faith community, and those values are embedded in all of the faith communities. I think Judaism, Islam, Hindu, Christianity, all of them exude those. And I think the faith community has a kind of a bipolarness
Mhm.
to it, because on one hand, it is incredibly good, uh, doing all the wonderful work around the world in this country, universities, hospitals, all kinds of things that they have done in this country to enhance and enrich the quality of life. But over and against that, they have also manifest incredible cruelty, bigotry, malice, prejudice, hatred. And so we in church world service must nurture those forces of compassion,
Mm.
those forces of goodness and generosity. Those are the things that church world service must do, can do, and will do in the now and in the future.
I think related to what you just mentioned is, the 75th anniversary is also being used to look back at our actions and then, look forward. One of the big topics in a lifetime is, fighting injustice and especially racial injustice.
Yes.
If I ask you to reflect back on, what you know about CWS, how do you look at the role of CWS in fighting specifically racial injustice? Have we succeeded? If so, how have we failed? To a certain extent, or completely? How? How do you look at that?
Well, it's easy to marshal words and shibboleths
Mhm.
in denouncing hatred and bigotry and malice. It's another thing to put your life and your organization on the line
Mm.
to advocate for um, better policies and laws and concerning
Mhm.
racial justice. And that's where I think that Church World Service has a role to marshal its resources and people to advocate for better policies regarding the police and racial justice and all the other things that need attending to in our society right now that is causing so much pain and hatred. And that's working on policy and laws is a much more difficult task. But we also need to speak out. Don't get me wrong. It was Martin Niemöller. He was a U-boat captain in World War I.
Hmm.
Afterwards, he wanted to do something with his life. He became a Lutheran pastor. And in World War II, he wrote this little piece of prose. First, they came for the Jews, but I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't speak out. And then they came for the homosexuals. I wasn't a homosexual, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the trade unionists. I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak out. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak for me. So speak out in your whatever organization or whatever you're a part of, to speak out against some of the injustice and hatred and bigotry and malice that are abroad in the land. The more people of goodwill speak out and work for greater justice, the greater justice we'll have.
And do you think CWS has done that often enough if you look at its history?
Probably not, but we keep trying. And I remember, if I could tell this little story,
Sure.
it illustrates, I think. I was in Haiti visiting and doing some work and looking at some of our projects. And they said, would you like to go and see this project where we are helping people get their civil and human rights back and confronting authorities, teaching them how to confront authorities? And I said, of course, I always wanted to see and some of our work and what we were doing. And so we started out. They said it's way up in the mountains. I said, that's all right. But it was on one of the worst living gizzard roads I'd ever been on. The living gizzard road is a road that my mother said would shake the living gizzards right out of you. And we were on this living gizzard road for hour after what seemed like hour after hour. And I was getting sick, to tell you the truth. I had a headache. I said, how much further is this? Well, no one seemed to know exactly where it was we were going. And I said, there's a farmer there that's working in his field. Go and ask him how much further this place is. And he said, well, it's more near than far. That we don't ever get exact distances in some of these places. It's more near than far. So we started out. I said, now look, if we're not there in the next half hour, we're going to turn around and go back to Port-au-Prince. But fortunately, we arrived. And we no sooner stopped our little caravan in front of the church than the people streamed out, hugging us and singing us into the church. We got in a big circle, and they told their stories of how much this project had meant to them as they confronted evil and bigotry, getting their civil and human rights back. Then they told me how long it took for them to get there. 2 hours walking, 4 hours walking. One man walked 8 hours most of the time in the rain to get there to tell me his story of how much this project meant to him. I felt like this, of course. And then we stood in a circle and sang the hymn, O Lord, my God, how great thou art. And tears ran down my cheeks. And they came up to me afterwards and they said, Reverend Page, why are you crying? And I said, the last time I sang that song was in the Bongsu Church of Pyongyang, North Korea. And I knew the suffering that they had gone through, the gulag, taken off into the gulags, some of their pastors summarily shot. And I knew they stood with you to stay on this mountain, singing with you, O Lord, my God, how great thou art. So yes, it's important for us to work together, pray together, and serve together, whether we're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, working together to reinforce the forces of compassion in not only the community we find ourselves, but all over the world.
Thanks, Rodney. You know, when I'm asked to kind of describe the path and the road of church world service, I often say, and you know, I think church world service evolved, you know, over time. It started as a U.S. Christian organization that tried to work ecumenically, but then I think over time it became a global interfaith organization. Now, if I say this, you know, some people say, yes, Maurice, you're right. I agree. And there are other people who are saying, no, I maybe understand why you're saying this, but I think you're not correct. And then they explain. How would you react to my description of this?
Well, that is a loaded question, Maurice. And I was asked to write an article
Mhm.
with a Roman Catholic archbishop writing. Each of us were to define the word ecumenical
Mhm.
and what this Greek word meant, oikumene. And the archbishop said it means pan-Christian, the whole panoply of Christian denominations and organizations. But I didn't, and I got in a little trouble for it. But I said, literally, the word oikumene, ecumenical, means the whole household of God. Not only people of Jewish and Christian and Muslim faith and all the other faiths, but people of no faith, no particular faith. Oikumene means the whole household of God. So that's what I mean when I say Church World Service is an ecumenical organization.
What do you think in terms of, my description of a U.S. organization towards a global organization?
Yes, it did start. I think, as I remember, particularly, it was in response to World War II, especially the crop when we started trains on the West Coast, snaking their way across the country.
Yeah.
And a commentator that was very popular at the time, I can't remember his name, got behind this, and the train stopping along the way all across America as people put their goods, their clothes, and all kinds of things on the train to save Europe that was freezing to death and it was dying after the terrible war had wiped out millions of people. And they ended up on the East Coast and put into ships. I think, and that's how it was a pan-Christian organization at that time. But its role and its involvement all over the world. And thanks be to the vision of my predecessors and boards and volunteers and staff, we're a worldwide organization operating in over 80 countries around the world. And because of their foresight and working together, that we have such a wonderful organization that has today does so much to enrich the quality of life for so many people, literally millions of people around the world.
Great, thanks. Rodney, if I ask you to share an anecdote or an experience which best describes your time with CWS, what would you share with me?
Well, there are so many different experiences that I've had at Church World Service that have enriched my life so many times that it's hard to say one particular thing that denotes that. But I will say that my involvement of Church World Service, particularly in the Middle East, to try to bring some semblance of reconciliation between Jews and Christians and Muslims, has been, I think, one of, and this is a little known story of Church World Service, I think a little told story of how much Church World Service works behind the scenes to bring people together on common projects that working together. I remember when there were a bunch of mosques and churches burned in Indonesia by rioters. Church World Service got together groups of young people, Muslim young people, and Christian young people, and Buddhist young people to work together to rebuild mosques, to rebuild churches. And I remember here in the United States, when there was a burning of so many Blackburn churches in rural areas, I was asked to be put in charge of the rebuilding of Blackburn churches. And we got people of different faiths and of no faiths working together. I got Weyerhaeuser Lumber Company to donate all the lumber that we needed in rebuilding the churches. And people working together across lines enhances, I think, enriches their experience of knowing one another, knowing the other, working together with the other, that sometimes we put in our minds the other as being one of hating the other. So these kinds of programs and projects that Church World Service has put together over the years has deeply, I think, brought together people of different faiths working together across not only denominational lines, but also around different faith lines as well.
Great. No, and the way you describe Church World Service, I think listeners get a pretty good idea of what type of organization Church World Service is. If I ask you to name one colleague of CWS colleague, or a CWS partner, or a CWS supporter, who best embodies of what CWS is about according to you, who would you name and why?
Oh, I don't know if there's any one particular one. There isn't. But I think of different experiences that I had. One of them, I decided I would write personal notes to all of our contributors that I could, that had given substantial amounts of money to us. And I just wanted to keep in touch with people and invite them to go on a project that they might like to see. And this was right after the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so I got a note from Elkhart to put all this together for me, who was in charge of Church World Service Development. And they gave me write a note to Howard E. Butts. Howard E. Butts, I said, who is that? He owns a grocery store in Texas. I said, okay. So I wrote it thanking him for his contribution and inviting him to go with me and several others on a trip to Bosnia and Herzegovina. He wrote back with another big check saying he couldn't go, but thank you for the invitation. Later, when I retired to Texas, living there half-time and half-time in Portland, and I found out who Howard E. Butts was. He owns H-E-B, which is the largest chain of grocery stores in Texas. And so I have had so many wonderful experiences with contributors, people who have found in Church World Service the kind of organization they wish to support. I think of Linda Hartke, who was my deputy. I had heard about her. She was the director of Cambodia. And I said I was coming to Cambodia. I would like to talk with her. And she then became my deputy because I saw in her the kind of organization that Church World Service was. Let me tell you this story about Cambodia, because I think it denotes just exactly what you're asking. After the defeat of Pol Pot in the Khmer Rouge, at least they fled to the highlands, and they were defeated because the Vietnamese came in and drove them out. Church World Service was asked to go on a plane from Hanoi into Phnom Penh to make an assessment of what needed to be done. And they were on that plane with a lot of other aid agencies. After the day was through and the different aid organizations had determined what they saw that needed to be done to report back to the United States or wherever their organization was they got on the plane to go back to Hanoi, with the exception of Church World Service, who stayed and stayed and stayed. And they built aquifers and bridges and schools and all kinds of roadways. And they're still there working, doing projects in Cambodia. I was asked to go to Cambodia, to the capital, and receive the highest honor bestowed upon a nonprofit organization because of the work that Church World Service did. I remember going out into the field, seeing laborers, peasants clearing the land. The government gave to Church World Service thousands of acres of land that had lain fallow during the Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge and had been overgrown with all kinds. They said, the land is yours. So we said to the peasants, you help us clear this land, and then it's yours. And we divided it up into so many hectares. And from that, to this day, people have land of their own because of the work of Church World Service.
Great. Thanks for sharing that story, Rodney. And we are still there, as you mentioned. And actually, our office in Cambodia is led by somebody of Cambodia.
Oh, yeah.
I think that also speaks to how Church World Service works. I would like to talk with you a little bit about what we, some people call the brand of Church World Service. Because this 75th anniversary is also taken as an opportunity to look at ourselves and where we do we need to go. One of the challenges that we have, and that's maybe similar to the other faith-based NGOs as well, is how do we attract the younger generation? Because that is related with the number of young people going to church, among others. So many discussions are going on around the branding and what type of organization we would like to be. But a piece of it is also the discussion if Church World Service should maybe change its name. Why? Because with the younger generation, especially, if you'd like to enter the door and you say that you're Church World Service, with a lot of young people, the door stays closed. So I would like just to hear from you, what your perspective is if you hear this. And again, nothing is set in stone at all. This is just part of a discussion, but I would just like to hear your 2 cents of, the fact that we are looking into this.
Well, I think in terms of any goal, there are several doors and several paths to that goal. Having the name CWS, not explaining exactly what CWS is or all about, certainly may be one path to that goal. Church World Service may be another path to that goal. Whatever path we come up with, the goal is still the same: to alleviate human suffering, to enrich the quality of life for others, to assist all the poor and the powerless whose way is hard in this life, and especially to those who are experiencing trauma and various and sundry things like tornadoes and hurricanes, typhoons, emergency response. So the goal is the same. The path may be different to get to that goal for different kinds of groups we appeal to. We don't have to use the same language to appeal to every single group. And we might want to use more of our churchy language to appeal to people of faith, but it may be a different language trying to appeal to young people and people who have different kinds of faith. God comes clothed to us in many different garments, and but we're still the God of peace and justice. It's still the God of kindness and generosity.
Great, thank you. I like music myself. It's a very important part of my life, and that's why I always have a question related with music. So I would also like to ask you this one. And if I ask you to come up with a song or a piece of music that represents CWS, according to you, what is the piece of music or the song?
Oh, not very good at music, Maurice. Some of my favorite hymns, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise." That's comes from my own long history and background as a pastor. And then, "Oh Lord, my God, how great thou art" is the one that certainly affected me and meant some of my work that I was involved in by other Christians in other parts of the world who sang it. And by the way, that was an interesting experience I had of the Bangsu Church in Pyongyang, North Korea. I remember worshiping several times in that church. I went to North Korea 3 times. We were put in charge of the World Food Program there in North Korea because of the famine. I remember the first time I went there. I can't remember the date, but it was a terrible famine. It was in January. The temperature was 55 degrees below zero with a wind chill factor. As I boarded the plane there in China, I could see in this old beat up plane that the North Koreans were picking it up, and bullet holes that had been shot in the plane had been patched. And I wondered if I was going to make it to North Korea or not. But we got in, and as I was being driven from the airport into the capital to stay in the hotel there, I saw all the trees from high as you could reach, stripped of the bark all the way down, as people were stripping the bark off these trees, grinding it up and making it to eat in various ways. People were literally dying in the streets. And I went to this Bangsu church, and we had given them a noodle factory to make noodles. And they made noodles and gave them away to people at no charge. And the church was a beehive of activity, even though they had suffered so much after the war that occurred there in North and South Korea. And I noticed that the last time I was there, each time before they had a pin in them of the dear leader. You know, they had the great leader, which was the father, and then they had the dear leader, which was the son. And but now, when they entered the church, they silently took the pin off and put it in their pocket as a kind of a sign that they were independent in their church of anybody, and they belonged to Jesus Christ.
And do you remember when this was?
1998, I think.
What do you want to say, or what do you want to wish for CWS?
Well, I remember at the 50th anniversary, we invited Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa to come and be the keynoter. Archbishop Tutu told me he was suffering from prostate cancer and wasn't accepting speaking engagement. But he said, Rodney, I will be there. Why? Because during apartheid's darkest days, Church World Service fed our families and kept hope alive. Kept hope alive. And I will be there. And he was. I have a picture of Archbishop Desmond Tutu and myself. It will forever hang wherever I go, in whatever domicile I find myself in, because of his story of hope. Hope is, to me, the word that defines the work and ministry of Church World Service. Hope for the future, hope in people. Hope is the key to the future of the world. And in God, we place our hope. And because hope was the key word for the 50th anniversary when Desmond Tutu came, and we kept hope alive in apartheid's darkest hours, that is what Church World Service must keep alive for all people in the future. Keep hope alive.
Thank you so much, Rodney, for your willingness to talk with me today, and also for, I forgot about your capacity to share stories. So I'm really feel really privileged that I was able to spend this time with you, and I'm sure the listeners also enjoyed this. So thank you so much for what you're still doing.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you very much. I worked with some wonderful people at Church World Service that have really meant so much to me in my life. And I know that John is feeling the same way, that his life has been enriched because of his experience of working with so many wonderful people there.
So thanks, Rodney, a lot.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you for your thoughtful questions, which jogged my memory of many things. I really appreciate reestablishing contact with you, and it's been delightful for me to work through some of these. But I will say I wrote down some other questions, other words that denote. Besides, I had partnership, community, and hope, and listening. But a couple other words that I did want to put in were humility. And that should always be a word that Church World Service should have in its lexicon, is the word humility. Because when you exude the braggadocio and exude overconfidence, it puts people and groups off. And that's what Church World Service, I think, has never done. And always it should cloak itself in humbleness and humility and listening to others. Thank you.
Do you see you? Do you see me? Will you be the eyes so that we all can be?
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And if you want to know more about Church World Service, please go to cwsglobal.org.